Introduction. The forgotten heroes of history. Welcome, fellow travelers through time, to one of history's most remarkable untold stories. Tonight, we embark on a journey into the lives of medieval Europe's most resilient survivors, the peasants, who comprised over 90% of the population, yet whose stories are rarely told with the depth and respect they deserve. These weren't just background characters in the grand theater of medieval history. They were the backbone of civilization, the unsung heroes who kept the world turning through sheer determination, ingenuity, and an almost supernatural ability to endure. Before we begin this epic tale, I want you to imagine something. Picture yourself stripped of every modern comfort you take for granted. No central heating, no electricity, no supermarkets, no medical care as we know it, no weatherproof clothing, and certainly no guarantee that you'll see another spring. Now imagine that this isn't a camping trip or a survival challenge with an end date. This is your entire life, and the lives of your children, and their children after them. As we settle in for this journey together, dim those lights, perhaps light a candle to set the mood, and let's transport ourselves back nearly 1,000 years to discover how our ancestors not only survived, but thrived in conditions that would challenge even the most prepared modern survivalist. Their story is one of breathtaking ingenuity, unbreakable community bonds, and a relationship with nature so intimate that it borders on the mystical. The tale we're about to unfold spans centuries and continents, from the windswept moors of Scotland to the frozen steppes of Eastern Europe, from the dense forests of Germany to the agricultural heartlands of France. It's a story that will change how you think about human resilience, community, and what it truly means to survive against impossible odds. Chapter 1. The reality of medieval life. Beyond the Hollywood fantasy, when most people think of medieval times, their minds conjure images painted by Hollywood and romantic literature: gallant knights in shining armor, grand castles with soaring spires, elaborate feasts with endless courses, and fair maidens in flowing gowns. The reality for 95% of the medieval population was starkly, brutally different. The average medieval peasant lived in what historians call a subsistence economy, meaning every single day was focused on acquiring just enough food, warmth, and shelter to survive until tomorrow. There was no surplus, no savings account, no insurance policy. Life hung by a thread so thin that a single bad harvest, a harsh winter, or an outbreak of disease could mean the difference between life and death for entire communities. Let's paint a more accurate picture of medieval peasant life, starting with their homes. Forget the cozy cottages with smoking chimneys and window boxes full of flowers that appear in children's storybooks. The typical peasant dwelling was a single room, roughly 12 to 16 feet on each side, housing not just the nuclear family but often extended relatives, and crucially, the family's most valuable possessions, their livestock. These homes were constructed using what we now call wattle and daub, a technique that sounds quaint but was born of pure necessity. Wattle refers to a framework of interwoven sticks, branches, and reeds, essentially creating a giant basket in the shape of walls. The daub was a mixture of clay, soil, sand, straw, and yes, animal dung. Before you wrinkle your nose in disgust, understand that this wasn't about being primitive or unsanitary. Dung, particularly from cows and horses, contains fibrous material that acts as a binding agent, making the wall mixture stronger and more weather-resistant. It also had antimicrobial properties and, when dried, was virtually odorless. But here's the crucial detail that most historical accounts gloss over. These walls were rarely more than 6 inches thick. In contrast, modern house walls are typically 4 to 6 inches of insulation, sandwiched between much thicker protective layers. Medieval peasants were essentially living inside what we would consider a garden shed, trying to survive winters that could last from October through April. The roof presented its own challenges. Thatched roofs, made from local materials like straw, reed, or heather, were the only option for peasants who couldn't afford expensive tiles or slate. When properly constructed and maintained, thatch could actually provide excellent insulation. Trapped air within the organic material created a barrier against heat loss. However, maintaining a thatched roof required specific skills and regular upkeep that many peasants simply couldn't afford. A well-maintained thatched roof needed to be replaced every 15 to 25 years and required annual repairs. The thatch had to be laid at precisely the right angle to steep, and it would shed water but let in wind. too shallow and it would leak constantly. Finding the right materials was often a challenge. The best thatch required long, straight straw that came from specific grains harvested at exactly the right time. Poor peasants often had to make do with whatever organic material they could scavenge, leading to roofs that leaked, sagged, and provided minimal insulation. Inside these humble dwellings, the concept of privacy as we understand it simply didn't exist. The entire family, parents, children, elderly grandparents, sometimes unmarried siblings or cousins, all shared this single space. But it wasn't just humans. Chickens roosted in corners or in boxes suspended from the rafters. A pig might be kept in a small pen partitioned off in one corner. Sometimes a cow or goat would be brought inside during the worst weather. This wasn't about poor planning or lack of space. It was a brilliant survival strategy. Animals generate significant body heat, and in a time before any form of artificial heating beyond fire, that warmth could mean the difference between life and death. The animals also represented the family's wealth and food security, so protecting them from theft, predators, and harsh weather was just as important as protecting the human members of the family. The floor was typically packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes, straw, or herbs. Stone floors were a luxury reserved for the wealthy. These earthen floors became muddy during wet weather and dusty during dry periods, but they had advantages too. Earth naturally regulated humidity and provided some insulation from the cold ground beneath. Furniture was minimal and multifunctional. A typical peasant home might contain a rough wooden table that also served as a workspace. A few three-legged stools, four-legged furniture would wobble on uneven floors, some wooden bowls and spoons, a few clay pots, and perhaps a wooden chest for storing the family's few precious possessions, extra clothing, seed for the next planting, maybe a small amount of salt or other valuable commodities. Beds, as we understand them, were rare. Most peasants slept on straw or hay-filled mattresses placed directly on the floor, or on simple wooden platforms raised just enough to avoid the worst of the ground's cold and dampness. These mattresses were actually large sacks that could be emptied, refilled, and moved as needed. The straw or hay inside needed to be changed regularly to prevent it from rotting, harboring insects, or becoming a health hazard. Privacy for intimate moments between married couples was achieved through curtains made from rough cloth. Careful timing, or simply the understanding that everyone pretended not to notice what was happening on the other side of the room. Children learned about the realities of life, birth, death, and everything in between, not through formal education but through daily observation in these close quarters. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Survival. Understanding medieval construction. To truly appreciate the ingenuity of medieval peasants, we need to delve deeper into the construction techniques they developed out of pure necessity. These weren't primitive building methods, they were sophisticated solutions developed over centuries of trial and error, passed down through generations of builders who understood their local environment better than any modern engineer. Foundation of a peasant home began with site selection, and this choice could determine whether a family thrived or perished. Experienced peasants knew to look for slightly elevated ground that would drain well during the spring snowmelt and autumn rains. They avoided low-lying areas that might flood, but also avoided the tops of hills where wind exposure would be too severe. The ideal spot was on a gentle slope, protected from prevailing winds by natural features like forests or hills, but with good southern exposure to capture winter sunlight. Once the site was chosen, the construction process began with creating a foundation not of stone or concrete, but of carefully selected stones, sometimes just raised earth mounds, designed to keep the wooden frame slightly off the ground to prevent rot. This seemingly simple step was crucial for the building's longevity and the health of its inhabitants. The wattle framework required specific knowledge about wood selection and seasoning. The main posts and beams were typically made from oak, ash, or other hardwoods that could bear significant weight and resist decay. These timbers were often green, freshly cut rather than dried, because seasoned wood was expensive and took years to prepare. Working with green wood required understanding how it would shrink and move as it dried, and experienced builders knew how to account for this settling. The smaller branches used for the wattle weaving were often hazel, willow, or birch woods that remained flexible even when dry. These had to be harvested at specific times of year when the sap was low, but the branches were still pliable. The weaving pattern itself was an art form. with different regions developing their own techniques for creating the strongest, most weather-resistant frameworks. Creating the daub mixture was both art and science. The clay had to be the right consistency. Too much clay, and the mixture would crack as it dried. Too little, and it wouldn't bind properly. The proportions varied, depending on local soil conditions, climate, and available materials. In areas with poor clay soil, peasants learned to trade or travel considerable distances to find the right materials. The animal dung used in daub wasn't just any manure. Horse dung was prized for its fibrous content and relatively pleasant smell. When dried, cow dung was also excellent, while pig manure was generally avoided because of its acidity. The dung had to be aged properly. Fresh manure would cause the mixture to ferment and weaken, while over-aged dung lost its binding properties. Hair from animals was often added to the mixture as additional binding material. This wasn't just a random addition. Hair creates a network of tiny fibers throughout the dried daub that helps prevent cracking and adds tensile strength. Some regions used chopped straw or other plant fibers for the same purpose. The application of daub was a community effort that required speed and coordination. Once mixed, daub had to be applied quickly before it began to set. The entire community would often participate in daubing bees' social events, where everyone worked together to complete the walls of a new home or repair an existing one. This wasn't just practical cooperation. It was social bonding that strengthened community ties essential for survival. The technique for applying daub required skill and experience. It had to be pressed firmly into the wattle framework to eliminate air pockets, but not so aggressively that it damaged the underlying structure. The surface needed to be smoothed to shed water effectively, but not made so smooth that additional coats wouldn't adhere properly. Many peasant homes featured decorative elements that served practical purposes. Geometric patterns pressed into the wet daub weren't just artistic expression. They created surface texture that helped shed water and provided additional grip for limewash or other protective coatings that might be applied later. The roofing process was equally sophisticated. Creating a thatched roof began with constructing the roof framework, typically made from locally sourced timber. The angle of the roof, called the pitch, had to be precisely calculated for the local climate. In areas with heavy snowfall, steeper pitches were necessary to shed the weight of accumulated snow. In regions with high winds but less snow, lower pitches provided better wind resistance. The thatch itself was laid in overlapping layers, starting from the bottom edge and working upward. Each bundle of thatch material was carefully positioned and secured with techniques that varied by region. Some areas used wooden stakes driven through the thatch into the roof structure below. Others used weighted ropes or special clips made from splitwood. The quality of thatch material made an enormous difference in the roof's performance and longevity. The best thatch came from grain crops harvested at exactly the right moment. Too early and the straw would be weak and prone to decay. Too late and it would be brittle and difficult to work with. Wheat straw was considered the gold standard, where available, but barley, oats, rye, and even rice straw in appropriate climates could all be used effectively. In regions where grain straw wasn't available, peasants developed alternatives using local materials. Reed thatch, made from water reeds, harvested from marshes and rivers, was extremely durable and could last 50 to 80 years if properly maintained. Heather thatch, common in Scotland and other moorland regions, provided excellent insulation but required different laying techniques. Some coastal areas used seaweed mixed with straw, creating a unique composite material that was both waterproof and insulating. The ridge of the roof, where the two sides met at the peak, required special attention and techniques. This was the most vulnerable point for water infiltration, so experienced thatchers developed elaborate methods for creating watertight ridges. Some used clay or mortar, others wove special ridge pieces from the finest available materials, and some created intricate, overlapping patterns that could shed even driving rain. Maintaining a thatched roof was an ongoing process that required the entire community's cooperation. Individual families rarely had all the skills needed for major roof repairs, so communities developed systems for sharing expertise, materials, and labor. This mutual dependence created strong social bonds and ensured that essential knowledge was preserved and passed down through generations. Chapter 3. The thermal reality, understanding heat and cold in medieval times. To comprehend the true challenge of surviving medieval winters, we must first understand the thermal dynamics of peasant dwellings and the physiological realities of human survival in extreme cold. Modern people, accustomed to thermostats and central heating, can barely imagine living in structures where indoor temperatures routinely dropped below freezing. The science of heat loss reveals why medieval peasants faced such extreme challenges. Heat escapes buildings through four primary mechanisms: conduction, direct transfer through solid materials; convection, air movement, carrying heat away; radiation, electromagnetic transfer; and evaporation, moisture, carrying heat as it changes from liquid to vapor. Medieval peasant homes were vulnerable to all four types of heat loss simultaneously. Conduction was perhaps the most significant problem. The thin walls of wattle and daub construction provided minimal barrier against heat transfer. Modern insulation works by trapping dead air. Space air that can't move doesn't carry heat away. Medieval walls had virtually no trapped airspace, meaning heat conducted directly from the warm interior through the wall materials to the cold exterior. A 6-inch medieval wall might have an insulation value roughly equivalent to a single modern window. Convection presented equally serious challenges. Medieval homes were inevitably drafty because achieving airtight construction was virtually impossible with available materials and techniques. Every gap between wall materials, every imperfection in the thatched roof, every space around the door created pathways for air movement. Cold air would infiltrate at ground level, while warm air escaped through the roof, creating constant circulation that carried away precious heat. The chimney effect, warm air rising and escaping through openings at the top of the structure, while cold air is drawn in at the bottom, was particularly devastating in single-room homes with high roofs. The very design necessary for accommodating families and livestock created ideal conditions for heat loss through convection. Radiation. Heat loss occurred whenever warm interior surfaces faced cold exterior walls, windows, or openings. Human bodies constantly radiate heat, and in medieval homes with large surface areas of cold walls, occupants would feel cold even when air temperature was technically above freezing. This radiant heat loss explains why peasants often felt cold, even when sitting near fires. While one side of their body received radiant heat from the flames, the other side was radiating heat toward the cold walls. Fuel management was a constant concern that shaped daily routines and seasonal activities. Wood was the primary fuel, but not all wood was equal. Peasants developed encyclopedic knowledge of local wood species and their burning characteristics. Oak burned hot and long but was slow to ignite. Pine started easily but burned quickly and created dangerous sparks. Birch provided excellent kindling, while apple or cherry wood burned cleanly and provided pleasant aromas. The process of fuel gathering began in spring and continued through autumn. Families would venture into forests to collect deadfall, cut branches, and gather dried materials. This wasn't casual collecting. It required understanding of which wood was properly seasoned, knowledge of property rights and forest laws, and careful planning for the entire year's fuel needs. Peasants developed sophisticated techniques for processing and storing fuel. Wood had to be cut to proper lengths, split to appropriate sizes, and stacked in ways that promoted air circulation for drying while protecting it from rain and snow. Different types of fuel required different storage methods. Kindling needed to be kept absolutely dry, while larger logs could tolerate some moisture if they were properly seasoned. The art of fire, starting in medieval times, was both more challenging and more sophisticated than modern people realize. There were no matches, lighters, or other convenient ignition sources. The most common method involved using flint and steel to create sparks, which were caught in tinder, carefully prepared combustible material that could catch and hold a tiny spark. Tinder preparation was a crucial skill that could mean the difference between warmth and freezing. The finest tinder was made from charred cloth, fabric that had been heated in the absence of air until it was carbonized but not burned. This char cloth would catch the smallest spark and glow reliably, allowing time to add additional combustible materials and build up to actual flames. Alternative tinder materials included punk wood, decayed wood that caught sparks easily, dried fungi, fine grass, bark fibers, and even materials like linen or hemp processed specifically for fire starting. Each type of tinder had advantages and disadvantages, and experienced firekeepers maintained supplies of multiple types to ensure They could start fires under any conditions. The actual technique of fire starting required patience, skill, and often considerable physical effort. Flint and steel had to be struck at exactly the right angle with exactly the right force to produce sparks. These sparks had to be directed onto the tinder, which then had to be gently blown upon to encourage combustion without extinguishing the delicate ember. From there, progressively larger materials were added, first fine kindling, then larger twigs, then branches, and finally substantial fuel would dot this entire process. Could take anywhere from a few minutes to over an hour, depending on conditions, materials, and skill level. In wet weather, cold conditions, or with poor materials, starting a fire could be extremely challenging or even impossible. This is why maintaining an existing fire was so much more practical than starting new ones. Medieval peasants developed ingenious techniques for keeping fires alive continuously. Banking a fire, covering hot coals with ash to slow combustion while preserving the ember, allowed fires to survive overnight or even through several days if done properly. The skill lay in using exactly the right amount of ash to slow combustion without extinguishing it, and in knowing which types of wood created the longest lasting coals. Some communities developed cooperative fire management systems. Neighbors would take turns maintaining fires, with one household keeping a fire burning while others allowed theirs to bank down. In emergencies, embers could be carried from house to house in special containers designed to transport fire safely. These fire carriers were often made from perforated metal or clay, designed to provide enough air circulation to keep embers alive while containing them safely. The social and cultural significance of fire extended far beyond its practical applications. The hearth was where families gathered for meals, conversation, and evening activities. It was where children learned essential skills by watching adults, where stories were told, where important family decisions were made. The fire was often considered sacred, with traditions and superstitions surrounding its care and feeding. Many cultures had elaborate rituals around fire maintenance. Some families never allowed their hearth fire to go completely cold throughout the winter, believing that an extinguished fire brought bad luck or even death. Others had specific procedures for lighting the first fire of winter or the last fire of spring. These weren't just superstitions, they reflected the profound understanding that fire was literally the difference between life and death. The economics of fire were also crucial to understanding medieval peasant life. Fuel represented a significant expense in terms of time and labor, even when it was gathered rather than purchased. Families had to balance the heat needed for survival against the fuel available, leading to sophisticated strategies for minimizing fuel consumption while maintaining adequate warmth. Chapter 5. Clothing as armor. The medieval layering system. Medieval peasant. Clothing was not fashion, it was survival technology. Every garment was designed with multiple functions: protection from cold, durability for hard labor, practicality for daily tasks, and economy in materials and construction. Understanding medieval clothing systems reveals sophisticated strategies for maintaining body heat and surviving harsh conditions that modern outdoor gear still tries to emulate. The foundation of medieval cold weather clothing was layering. The peasants understood this principle through experience rather than modern textile science. The basic concept was creating multiple air gaps between the body and the exterior environment, with each layer serving specific functions in thermal regulation and protection. The base layer, worn directly against the skin, was typically a linen shift or chemise. Linen was preferred for this layer because it wickered moisture away from the skin and could be washed regularly, crucial for health and comfort. This garment was usually the only one that touched the body directly, serving as a barrier between skin and the rougher materials of outer garments. The middle layers provided the primary insulation. Wool was the dominant material for these garments because of its unique properties. Wool fibers have a natural crimp that creates air pockets, providing insulation even when wet. Wool also retains its insulating properties even when soiled, important for people who couldn't wash their clothing frequently. A typical winter outfit for a peasant might include a wool tunic, wool hose, tight-fitting leg coverings, and a wool surcoat or cot. These weren't the refined garments worn by nobility. Peasant wool was often coarse, itchy, and roughly finished. However, it was effective insulation that could be produced locally using sheep owned by the peasant, family, or bartered from neighbors. The outer layer provided wind and water resistance. Cloaks were essential garments that served multiple functions beyond clothing. A good cloak could serve as a blanket, ground covering, shelter material, or even a stretcher in emergencies. Peasant cloaks were typically made from tightly woven wool, sometimes treated with lanolin or other substances to improve water resistance. The construction and design of medieval clothing reflected deep understanding of human physiology and heat conservation. Garments were typically loose-fitting rather than tight, creating air spaces that provided insulation. However, they were designed to minimize gaps where cold air could infiltrate. Sleeves were long and fitted at the wrists. Necklines were high, and garments overlapped to eliminate drafts. Fastenings were crucial details that revealed the sophistication of medieval clothing design. Buttons were expensive and rare for peasants, so most garments were secured with ties, pins, or simple toggles. These fastenings had to be adjustable to accommodate different layers underneath and changing weather conditions, while being simple enough to operate with cold. Clumsy fingers. Headwear was particularly important because the head loses heat rapidly due to high blood circulation in the scalp. Medieval peasants wore various types of head coverings, including coifs, close-fitting caps, hoods attached to cloaks, and felt hats. These weren't just protection against cold, they also protected against sun, rain, and injury during labor. Footwear presented enormous challenges for medieval peasants. Good boots or shoes were expensive and required skilled craftsmen to produce. Many peasants wore simple leather shoes that provided minimal insulation or protection. In extreme cold, they might wrap their feet in cloth or animal skins, stuff their shoes with straw or other insulating materials, or even wear wooden clogs that kept their feet off the cold ground. That the economics of medieval clothing were harsh realities that shaped every decision about garments and their care. A single garment represented weeks or months of labor, either the time required to produce the textile materials and construct the garment, or the work needed to earn money for purchase. Clothing was precious, carefully maintained, and often passed down through generations. Textile production was a crucial part of peasant household economy. Sheep provided wool, but the process of converting wool into wearable fabric was time-consuming and required multiple specialized skills. Wool had to be cleaned, carded, combed to align the fibers, spun into thread, and then woven into cloth. Each step required specific tools and techniques that were passed down through generations. Spinning was typically women's work and was done continuously during spare moments throughout the day. The spindle and distaff, tools for spinning thread from raw fibers, were constant companions. Women would spin while walking, while tending children, while supervising cooking. The phrase "spinning a yarn" comes from this constant activity, and the efficiency of household textile production often determined whether a family had adequate clothing for winter survival. Dyeing was another crucial skill that affected both the practicality and economics of clothing. Natural dyes were expensive and time-consuming to prepare, so most peasant clothing was undyed natural colors, the brown, gray, and cream colors of natural wool and linen. However, some dyes could be produced locally from plants, berries, or even mud and clay, allowing peasants to create clothing that was both functional and aesthetically pleasing. The maintenance and repair of clothing was a constant activity that required considerable skill. Medieval peasants became expert at patching, darning, and reconstructing garments to extend their useful life. A garment might be repaired multiple times, restructured as it wore out, and eventually recycled into cleaning cloths, stuffing materials, or even incorporated into other garments. The seasonal cycle of clothing management was carefully planned and executed. Summer was the time for major clothing construction and repair projects, when daylight hours were long and weather was favorable for working outdoors. Autumn required preparation and organization of winter garments, while winter was spent on smaller repair projects that could be done indoors by firelight. Spring brought cleaning and storage of heavy winter garments and preparation of lighter clothing for the coming year. Understanding medieval clothing also reveals the social and cultural dimensions of peasant life. Clothing identified social status, occupation, and regional origin. Certain colors, materials, or styles were reserved for specific social classes or forbidden to peasants by sumptuary laws. Within these constraints, peasants still found ways to express personal identity and regional pride through their clothing choices. The gendered aspects of medieval clothing reflected both practical considerations and cultural expectations. Men's clothing was generally designed for outdoor labor and mobility, while women's clothing accommodated household work and childcare. However, both men's and women's clothing had to serve the primary function of survival in harsh conditions, leading to more similarities than differences in basic construction and materials. Chapter 6. The Body as Furnace. Human heat generation and conservation. Medieval peasants understood their bodies as heat-generating machines that required specific management strategies to maintain core temperature and survive brutal winters. This understanding, developed through generations of experience rather than scientific education, led to sophisticated techniques for maximizing heat production, minimizing heat loss, and managing the human fuel system during extended periods of cold stress. The human body generates heat through several mechanisms, and medieval peasants learned to optimize each one through behavior, diet, and activity patterns. Basal metabolism, the energy required for basic cellular functions, provides a constant baseline of heat production, but this can be increased through specific foods and activities. Muscle activity generates additional heat through movement and work, while the process of digestion itself produces thermal energy. Understanding these principles, medieval peasants developed daily routines designed to maximize heat production. During the coldest periods, morning routines typically began with vigorous physical activity, not leisurely stretching, but energetic movement designed to stimulate circulation and raise core body temperature after a cold night's sleep. This might involve wood chopping, animal care, or other necessary work that served the dual purpose of generating heat and accomplishing essential tasks. The timing of meals was carefully coordinated with thermal management. The largest, most substantial meal of the day was typically eaten in early afternoon, when daylight hours were longest and outdoor work was most demanding. However, a smaller evening meal was also important because the digestive process generates heat that could help maintain body temperature through the cold night hours. Peasants learned that certain foods were more effective for heat generation than others. Foods high in fats and complex carbohydrates provided sustained energy that could fuel internal heat production for hours. Proteins required significant energy to digest, creating additional thermal output. Spicy foods, when available, could stimulate circulation and create sensations of warmth. The management of clothing layers throughout the day revealed sophisticated understanding of thermal regulation. Peasants didn't simply put on all available clothing and leave it on. Instead, they adjusted layers throughout the day based on activity levels, temperature changes, and specific tasks. Too much clothing during vigorous work could lead to dangerous overheating and sweating, while too little clothing during sedentary activities could result in rapid heat loss. Sleep presented particular challenges for heat conservation that required specific strategies. The transition from wakefulness to sleep involves a natural drop in core body temperature, and medieval peasants developed techniques to manage this vulnerability. Beds were positioned strategically in relation to heat sources, with the warmest sleeping spots reserved for the most vulnerable family members. Bedtime preparation involved specific rituals designed to maximize overnight warmth. Hot stones from the fire might be wrapped in cloth and placed in beds to provide radiant heat. Through the night, multiple family members would share beds, not just for space efficiency, but for shared body heat. Clothing worn to bed was carefully selected to provide insulation without restricting circulation or becoming damp from perspiration. The practice of bundling, sharing beds between unmarried couples or multiple family members, wasn't primarily about sexual intimacy but about survival. Body heat shared between multiple people could maintain survivable temperatures when individual heat production wasn't sufficient. This practice required social protocols and cultural norms to function effectively within community moral standards. Medieval peasants also understood the importance of circulation management for cold weather survival. They knew that extremities, fingers, toes, nose, and ears were most vulnerable to frostbite, because the body would restrict blood flow to these areas to preserve core temperature. Various techniques were employed to maintain circulation: vigorous rubbing of hands and feet, specific exercises that could be performed in small spaces, and positioning strategies that promoted blood flow. The phenomenon of afterdrop, the dangerous drop in core temperature that can occur when cold extremities are suddenly warmed, was understood through painful experience. Though peasants wouldn't have known the scientific explanation, they learned to warm frozen body parts gradually and carefully, often using their own body heat or gentle warming near the fire rather than direct heat exposure. Breathing techniques for cold weather were another sophisticated survival strategy. Medieval peasants learned to breathe through their noses rather than mouths when possible, allowing the nasal passages to warm and humidify incoming air. During extreme cold, they would cover their faces with cloth or fur to create a warming chamber for breath before it entered their lungs. The social aspects of thermal management were equally important. Families developed systems for sharing body heat efficiently while maintaining social propriety. Children would sleep between adults who could provide warmth on both sides. Elderly family members, who generated less body heat, would be positioned strategically to benefit from the warmth of younger, more metabolically active family members. Work activities were planned around thermal considerations. The most physically demanding tasks were scheduled for the coldest parts of the day to maximize heat generation when it was most needed. Less strenuous activities that could be performed while remaining relatively stationary were saved for warmer periods or were done near the fire. Chapter 7. Community as Lifeline. The social networks of survival in medieval times was never an individual endeavor. It was fundamentally a community enterprise that required elaborate networks of mutual support, shared resources, and collective knowledge. The harsh realities of medieval life made cooperation not just beneficial, but absolutely essential for survival. Understanding these community systems reveals how medieval peasants created resilience through social bonds that were both practical and profound. The basic unit of medieval rural life was not the individual family, but the village community, typically consisting of 20 to 100 households bound together by geographical proximity, economic interdependence, and shared survival challenges. These communities developed over generations into sophisticated support networks that functioned as extended survival systems, with each household contributing specific skills, resources, and labor to the collective welfare. Village layout itself reflected survival priorities and community organization. Houses were typically clustered together rather than scattered across the landscape, providing mutual protection, shared resources, and social cohesion. The central area often included common facilities like wells, ovens, mills, and churches that served the entire community. This clustering also facilitated rapid communication during emergencies and made it easier to share resources during crises. The sharing of essential resources was formalized through various community institutions and informal agreements. Many villages had common ovens where families could bake bread, reducing the fire hazards and fuel costs associated with individual household baking. These ovens were typically large, stone-built structures that required community cooperation to build and maintain, but which could serve multiple families efficiently. Mills for grinding grain were often community resources, owned either collectively or by a local lord, but available to all villagers. The miller was a crucial community member whose skills in maintaining and operating complex machinery were essential for converting grain into usable flour. The mill also served as a social gathering place where villagers exchanged news, gossip, and information while waiting for their grain to be processed. Seasonal labor sharing was perhaps the most crucial aspect of community survival systems. Agricultural activities like planting, harvesting, and processing crops required more labor than individual families could provide, leading to elaborate systems of cooperative work. During harvest time, entire communities would work together to bring in crops before weather could destroy them, with the understanding that everyone's survival depended on successful harvests. These work-sharing arrangements weren't casual cooperation. They were formal agreements governed by traditional customs and community enforcement. Families who failed to contribute their fair share of labor during community work periods would find themselves excluded from community support when they needed it most. This social pressure ensured that everyone participated in the collective efforts necessary for survival. The preservation and sharing of knowledge was another critical community function. In a largely illiterate society, essential survival information was preserved through oral tradition and practical demonstration. Older community members served as living libraries of crucial knowledge about weather patterns, agricultural techniques, food preservation, medical remedies, and craft skills. This knowledge transfer happened through formal apprenticeship systems and informal daily interaction. Young people learned essential skills by working alongside experienced adults, gradually acquiring the complex knowledge base necessary for survival. Master craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, served not just their individual households but the entire community, teaching their skills to the next generation while providing essential services. But medical knowledge and healthcare were communal resources managed primarily by women who specialized in herbal medicine, midwifery, and basic medical care. These village healers maintained knowledge of local medicinal plants, traditional remedies, and basic surgical techniques. Their services were available to the entire community, often in exchange for other goods and services, rather than direct payment. Community response to emergencies revealed the sophistication of medieval mutual aid systems. When fire destroyed a family's home, the entire community would mobilize to provide temporary shelter, share clothing and household goods, and organize rebuilding efforts. When illness struck a household, neighbors would take over essential tasks, like animal care and food preparation. During famines, communities developed systems for rationing available food to maximize survival rates. These emergency response systems weren't spontaneous charity. They were organized mutual insurance, systems based on the understanding that anyone could face disaster and that community survival required taking care of all members. Families contributed to community welfare with the expectation that they would receive similar support when they needed it. Religious institutions played crucial roles in community survival networks, though their function extended far beyond spiritual guidance. Churches served as community meeting places, information centers, and sometimes storage facilities for community resources. Religious festivals and observances provided opportunities for community bonding and mutual support that strengthened the social networks essential for survival. The parish priest often served multiple functions within the community's survival system. In addition to religious duties, priests were often among the few literate community members, serving as record keepers, letter writers, and sources of information from the outside world. They also provided mediation services for disputes and conflicts that could threaten community cohesion. Marriage patterns within medieval communities reflected survival considerations as much as romantic preferences. Marriages created alliances between families, combining resources and skills in ways that improved survival prospects for both households. Marriage negotiations often considered not just the personal compatibility of the couple, but the ways their union would strengthen community networks and resource availability. The care of orphans, widows, and disabled community members was handled through community systems that ensured no one was abandoned to face survival challenges alone. Orphan children were typically taken in by extended family members or other community families, while widows might be provided with small plots of land or other resources that allowed them to maintain independent households while remaining integrated into community support networks. Trade and economic exchange within communities operated on complex systems of barter, debt, and reciprocal obligation that facilitated resource sharing while maintaining social relationships. Money was often scarce in rural communities, so exchanges of goods and services operated through sophisticated systems of credit and obligation that could extend over months or years. These economic relationships weren't just commercial transactions, they were social bonds that created mutual dependence and reinforced community solidarity. A family might provide grain to a neighbor during a difficult year, with the understanding that they would receive help with labor or other resources when they needed it, creating networks of mutual obligation that strengthened community resilience. Chapter 8: Food as Fuel. Medieval nutrition and survival. Food in medieval peasant life was not about pleasure, variety, or even adequate nutrition as we understand it today. It was about acquiring sufficient calories and nutrients to fuel the human body through demanding physical labor and harsh environmental conditions. Understanding medieval food systems reveals both the remarkable ingenuity peasants employed to survive on limited resources and the constant precariousness of their nutritional situation. The medieval peasant diet was dominated by grains, which provided the bulk of daily calories for most of the population. Barley, oats, rye, and wheat formed the foundation of peasant nutrition, though the specific grains varied by region and climate. These grains were consumed primarily as bread, porridge, or ale, forms that made the nutrients more digestible and the calories more readily available. Bread was the staff of life in medieval Europe. But peasant bread was vastly different from modern bread. It was typically made from mixed grains rather than pure wheat, creating dense, dark loaves that were more nutritious but also more difficult to digest. The grinding process often left pieces of stone from the millstones in the flour, gradually wearing down peasants' teeth and contributing to various health problems. The quality of bread served as an indicator of both social status and seasonal food availability. During good harvests, bread might be made from higher quality grains with minimal adulterants. During food shortages, bread might be extended with ground acorns, bark, beans, peas, or other fillers that provided bulk but limited nutritional value. The darkest, coarsest bread, sometimes called brown bread or black bread, was the food of the poor and desperate. Porridge made from grains was equally important in the peasant diet and had several advantages over bread. It required less fuel to cook than baking bread, it was easier to digest, and it could incorporate other available ingredients like vegetables, herbs, or small amounts of meat or dairy products. A single pot of porridge cooking over the fire could feed an entire family while requiring minimal fuel and attention. The brewing and consumption of ale was not primarily about recreation. Ale was a crucial source of calories and nutrients, and often safer to drink than water. The brewing process involved converting grain starches into more easily digestible sugars, while creating an alcoholic content that provided additional calories and helped preserve the beverage. Low alcohol ale was consumed daily by all family members, including children, as a nutritional beverage rather than an intoxicant. Vegetables played important but seasonal roles in the medieval diet. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and onions could be stored through winter and provided essential nutrients during the lean months. Cabbage was particularly valuable because it could be preserved through fermentation, creating sauerkraut that provided vitamin C and other nutrients. During winter months, when fresh vegetables were unavailable, the cultivation of vegetables was typically done in small plots near peasant homes, often called kitchen gardens or cottage gardens. These plots were intensively cultivated using techniques that maximized production from limited space. Peasants developed sophisticated knowledge of companion planting, succession planting, and soil management that allowed them to produce substantial amounts of food from very small areas. Legumes, beans, peas, and lentils were crucial protein sources that also helped maintain soil fertility through nitrogen fixation. These crops were often grown in rotation with grains, improving soil quality while providing essential amino acids that were lacking in grain-based diets. Dried legumes could be stored for extended periods and provided protein-rich additions to porridges and stews throughout the year. Meat was a luxury for most peasants, available primarily during slaughter seasons in autumn or during special occasions. When animals were slaughtered, every part was utilized, nothing was wasted. Fresh meat would be consumed immediately, while other parts were preserved through salting, smoking, or other preservation methods that allowed protein to be available. Throughout the winter months, pork was the most common meat for peasants because pigs were efficient converters of food scraps and agricultural waste into protein. Pigs could be raised on relatively small amounts of land and could forage for much of their food, making them practical livestock for peasant families. The autumn pig slaughter was a major event that provided meat for the entire winter, with elaborate preservation techniques ensuring that nothing was wasted. Poultry, chickens, geese, and ducks provided both eggs and meat, while requiring minimal resources. Chickens could forage for much of their food and provided a steady supply of eggs that were crucial sources of protein and nutrients. Eggs could be preserved through various techniques, including storing them in lime water or other solutions that extended their usable life. Dairy products, when available, provided crucial nutrients including protein, fats, and calcium. However, dairy availability was seasonal and required significant resources to maintain dairy animals through winter months. Cheesemaking was a crucial skill that allowed milk to be preserved for extended periods, while concentrating nutrients into forms that could be stored without refrigeration. Fish provided protein for communities near rivers, lakes, or coasts, but preservation techniques were essential for making fish available year-round. Salting, smoking, and drying were common preservation methods that created concentrated protein sources that could be stored for months. Religious observances that required fasting from meat made fish particularly important during certain seasons. Seasonal food patterns dominated peasant nutrition, with distinct cycles of abundance and scarcity that required careful planning and resource management. Spring was often the hungriest season, when stored winter foods were running low but new crops hadn't yet matured. This period was sometimes called the hunger gap and required careful rationing of remaining food stores. Summer brought fresh vegetables and fruits that provided essential vitamins and nutrients but had to be consumed quickly or preserved for winter use. Autumn was harvest season, when the year's crop success determined whether the family would have adequate food through the coming winter. Winter required living primarily on stored foods, while maintaining enough nutrition to fuel the labor required. For daily survival, food preservation was perhaps the most crucial skill for medieval peasant survival. Without refrigeration or modern preservation techniques, peasants developed elaborate systems for extending the usable life of seasonal foods. Salt was the most valuable preservative, but was expensive and often difficult to obtain, leading to careful rationing and used primarily for the most important preservation projects. Smoking was another crucial preservation technique that required specific knowledge of wood types, temperature control, and timing. Different foods required different smoking techniques, and the quality of preservation could mean the difference between adequate winter nutrition and starvation. The construction and maintenance of smokehouses was a community skill that required cooperation and shared knowledge. Fermentation provided another preservation method that also enhanced the nutritional value of foods. Fermented vegetables, dairy products, and beverages provided essential nutrients while extending storage life. The management of fermentation processes required understanding of temperature control, timing, and the specific microorganisms involved in different types of fermentation. Chapter 9. Water. The liquid of life and death. Water in medieval times was simultaneously essential for survival and potentially deadly, creating a constant tension between the need for adequate hydration and the risk of waterborne disease. Understanding medieval water management reveals sophisticated strategies for obtaining, storing, and purifying water that required both technical knowledge and careful risk assessment. The sources of water available to medieval peasants varied greatly depending on geographic location, season, and community resources. Wells were the most desirable water source because they typically provided cleaner water than surface sources. But well construction required significant community investment and ongoing maintenance. A properly constructed well could serve a community for generations, but a poorly built or contaminated well could spread disease throughout the population. Well construction was a specialized skill that required understanding of groundwater, soil conditions, and stonemasonry. The well shaft had to be lined with stone to prevent contamination and collapse, while the top needed to be covered and secured to prevent surface water from carrying contaminants into the well. Many communities had regulations governing well construction and maintenance. Recognizing that water quality was a collective survival issue, rivers and streams provided water sources for many communities, but these surface waters carried significant risks of contamination from upstream sources. Peasants learned to select water collection points carefully, choosing locations upstream from known contamination sources and avoiding stagnant or obviously polluted water. They also developed techniques for improving water quality through settling, straining, and other basic purification methods. Springs were highly prized water sources because they often provided cleaner water than surface sources, while being more reliable than wells. However, springs were not available in all locations and required protection from contamination. Communities often built structures around springs to protect the water source and regulate access. Recognizing springs as valuable community resources, water storage presented significant challenges in an era without modern containers or preservation techniques. Clay pots and wooden barrels were the primary storage containers, but these had to be carefully maintained to prevent contamination and structural failure. Water stored in containers was vulnerable to algae growth, bacterial contamination, and freezing, requiring constant monitoring and management. The seasonal cycle of water availability created planning challenges that peasants had to anticipate and prepare for. Spring snowmelt and rain often provided abundant water, but this was also when contamination risks were highest, as runoff carried pollutants from surrounding areas. Summer might bring water shortages that required careful conservation and rationing. Winter presented the challenge of keeping water sources accessible and preventing stored water from freezing. Drought management required community cooperation and careful resource allocation. During extended dry periods, communities might need to restrict water usage, organize shared access to remaining sources, and implement conservation measures that ensured survival for all community members. These drought response systems were often formalized through community agreements and traditional practices passed down through generations. The purification of questionable water was a crucial survival skill that peasants developed through experience and traditional knowledge. Boiling was understood to improve water safety, though the scientific reasons weren't known. Water was often boiled as part of cooking processes, creating teas, ales, and other beverages that were safer than raw water, while providing additional nutrients and calories. Filtration through cloth, sand or charcoal was another purification technique that peasants employed to improve water clarity and reduce contamination. These filtration methods weren't sophisticated by modern standards, but they could remove visible particles and some contaminants that made water obviously unsafe. The addition of alcohol through brewing was perhaps the most important water purification strategy for medieval peasants. The brewing process created beverages that were both safer to drink than raw water and provided essential calories and nutrients. Low alcohol ales and wines were daily beverages for entire families, serving as safer alternatives to potentially contaminated water sources. Religious and cultural practices around water often reflected practical survival strategies disguised as spiritual observances. Blessing of water sources, restrictions on water use during certain seasons, and community rituals around well maintenance all served to protect crucial water resources while maintaining community cooperation in water management. The transportation of water was a daily task that required significant labor and planning. Water is heavy, roughly 8 pounds per gallon, and medieval peasants had to carry all water needed for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and livestock care from the source to their homes. This transportation burden influenced settlement patterns, with communities clustering around reliable water sources to minimize carrying distances. Water containers had to be designed for efficient transportation while preventing spillage and contamination. Clay jugs, wooden buckets, and leather containers were crafted with specific shapes and handles that made carrying easier while protecting the water inside. These containers required regular maintenance and replacement, representing a significant investment for peasant families. The sharing of water resources was another aspect of community cooperation that was essential for survival. Families living farther from water sources might depend on neighbors closer to sources for access, while those near water sources might receive other goods and services in exchange for sharing access. These water-sharing relationships were crucial components of community survival networks. Washing and hygiene presented complex challenges in water management because these activities required significant amounts of water while competing with drinking and cooking needs. Peasants developed efficient washing techniques that minimized water usage while maintaining basic hygiene necessary for health. Communal washing areas allowed multiple families to share water resources while socializing and maintaining community bonds. The care of animals required substantial amounts of water, especially during hot weather or when animals were working hard. Livestock water needs had to be balanced against human water needs, with careful planning required to ensure adequate water for both animals and people. During water shortages, difficult decisions had to be made about allocating limited water resources between human and animal needs. Chapter 10. The Healing Arts, Medieval Medicine and Survival. Medical care in medieval peasant communities was a complex blend of practical knowledge, herbal medicine, spiritual beliefs, and community support systems that functioned without formal medical training or modern pharmaceutical resources. Understanding medieval healthcare reveals sophisticated systems for maintaining health and treating illness that were often more effective than historical stereotypes suggest. The foundation of medieval peasant medicine was prevention through lifestyle management and environmental awareness. Peasants understood that maintaining health was far more practical than treating illness, leading to elaborate systems of health maintenance that integrated diet, exercise, seasonal activities, and environmental management. These preventive strategies were based on centuries of accumulated experience about what kept people healthy and productive. Herbal medicine formed the cornerstone of medieval medical treatment, with knowledge of medicinal plants representing one of the most sophisticated aspects of peasant culture. Village healers, usually women, maintained extensive knowledge of local flora and their medical applications. This knowledge included not just which plants were useful for specific conditions, but also when to harvest them, how to prepare them, what doses were effective, and how to combine different plants for enhanced effects. The cultivation of medicinal herbs was typically integrated into kitchen gardens and agricultural plots, ensuring that essential medicines were readily available when needed. Common medicinal plants included willow bark containing compounds similar to modern aspirin, echinacea for immune system support, chamomile for digestive issues and sleep disorders, and dozens of other plants with specific therapeutic applications. Preparation techniques for herbal medicines were sophisticated processes that required understanding of extraction methods, preservation techniques, and dosage calculations. Teas, tinctures, poultices, and salves were prepared using methods that maximized the therapeutic compounds while ensuring safe dosages. These preparation techniques were closely guarded knowledge passed down through generations of healers. The diagnosis of illness was based on careful observation of symptoms combined with understanding of seasonal patterns, dietary influences, and environmental factors that affected health. Medieval healers developed sophisticated diagnostic techniques that considered the whole person and their circumstances, rather than just isolated symptoms. This holistic approach often led to more effective treatments than focusing solely on specific symptoms. Surgical procedures, while limited by available tools and lack of antiseptic techniques, were more common and sophisticated than often assumed. Village healers performed basic surgical procedures, including setting bones, treating wounds, assisting with difficult births, and even simple operations like removing tumors or treating abscesses. These procedures were performed with tools that were cleaned as effectively as possible and techniques designed to minimize complications. Wound care was particularly important in agricultural communities, where injuries were common and proper treatment could mean the difference between quick recovery and life-threatening infection. Medieval healers developed effective techniques for cleaning wounds, controlling bleeding, preventing infection, and promoting healing using available materials and traditional knowledge. Childbirth and reproductive health were managed primarily by village midwives who possessed specialized knowledge about pregnancy, labor, delivery, and postpartum care. These women served essential roles in community health, not just assisting with births, but providing advice about family planning, treating reproductive health issues, and caring for newborns and mothers during the vulnerable postpartum period. Treatment of common diseases required understanding of symptoms, progression patterns, and available therapeutic interventions. Conditions like pneumonia, dysentery, fever, and various infections were treated using combinations of herbal medicines, supportive care, dietary modifications, and environmental management. While these treatments weren't always successful, they often provided significant relief and sometimes effected cures. Mental health and psychological well-being were addressed through community support systems, spiritual practices, and herbal treatments for conditions like depression, anxiety, and what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress. The recognition that mental and physical health were interconnected led to treatment approaches that addressed both psychological and physiological aspects of illness. Pain management was a crucial skill for medieval healers, who had to treat everything from chronic arthritis to acute injuries using available resources. Various plants provided analgesic effects, while techniques like massage, heat therapy, and careful positioning helped manage pain and promote healing. These pain management strategies were often remarkably effective given the limited resources available. The care of chronic conditions required long-term management strategies that integrated medical treatment with lifestyle modifications and community support. Conditions like arthritis, respiratory problems, and digestive disorders were managed through ongoing treatment programs that might include dietary changes, herbal medicines, physical therapy techniques, and environmental modifications. Epidemic diseases presented enormous challenges that required community-wide response strategies. When contagious diseases struck communities, medieval peasants implemented quarantine procedures, community care systems for the sick, and prevention measures designed to limit the spread of disease. While their understanding of disease transmission was limited, their practical responses often proved effective in controlling outbreaks. The integration of spiritual and medical practices reflected the holistic worldview of medieval peasants, who saw health as involving physical, mental, and spiritual components. Prayers, blessings, and religious rituals were often combined with medical treatments, creating comprehensive healing approaches that addressed multiple aspects of illness and recovery. Chapter 11. Seasonal Rhythms. The medieval calendar of survival. Medieval peasants' life was governed not by clocks and calendars as we know them, but by the subtle and dramatic rhythms of seasonal change that dictated every aspect of survival strategy. Understanding these seasonal patterns reveals how peasants synchronized their activities with natural cycles to maximize their chances of surviving each year's challenges. Spring arrived not with a calendar date, but with observable signs that peasants read like a complex language of survival. The first signs of ground thaw, the return of migrating birds, the swelling of buds on familiar trees, and the gradual lengthening of daylight hours all provided crucial information about timing. For essential activities, these natural indicators were far more reliable than crude calendar systems and allowed peasants to optimize their activities for changing conditions. The spring awakening required careful timing of numerous critical activities. Fields had to be prepared for planting when soil conditions were right, not too wet from snowmelt, but not so dry that hard earth couldn't be worked. Seed grain that had been carefully preserved through winter had to be allocated between food needs and planting requirements, often requiring difficult decisions about accepting hunger in spring to ensure food for the following winter. Spring cleaning was not a quaint domestic tradition but a crucial health and safety activity. Homes that had been sealed against winter weather needed thorough cleaning to remove accumulated smoke, soot, and the detritus of winter living. Bedding materials needed to be changed, clothing aired and cleaned, and living spaces reorganized. For the more active months ahead, the management of livestock during spring transition required careful attention to animal nutrition and health. Animals weakened by winter privation needed gradual introduction to fresh feed to avoid digestive problems. Breeding activities were timed to ensure that births occurred when weather was favorable and food was becoming more available. The birth of new livestock represented both increased future resources and immediate demands for care and feeding. Summer represented the period of maximum productivity and longest working hours, when peasants took advantage of extended daylight and favorable weather to accomplish tasks that were impossible during darker, colder months. The summer work schedule often involved rising before dawn and working until darkness, with brief rest periods during the hottest parts of the day. Agricultural activities during summer required intricate timing and intensive labor. Multiple crops at different stages of growth needed appropriate care, from newly planted seeds requiring protection and watering to maturing grains that needed constant monitoring for optimal harvest timing. The timing of hay cutting was particularly crucial. Hay cut too early lacked nutritional value, while hay cut too late became fibrous and less digestible for livestock. Construction and maintenance projects were concentrated during summer months, when weather was favorable and materials were most readily available. Roof repairs, wall maintenance, and other structural work required dry conditions and adequate working time. These projects often involved community cooperation, with multiple families working together on major construction projects that benefited the entire community. Food preservation activities intensified during summer as the season's abundance needed to be converted into winter survival resources. Vegetables had to be harvested at peak ripeness and immediately processed for storage. Fruits were dried, fermented into beverages, or cooked into preserves. Herbs were gathered at their peak potency and processed into medicines that would be needed during winter months. Autumn was perhaps the most critical season for peasant survival, when the success or failure of the year's agricultural efforts determined whether the family would survive the coming winter. Harvest timing required expert judgment. Crops harvested too early lacked full nutritional value, while crops left too long risked damage from weather or pests. The grain harvest was the culmination of the agricultural year, requiring intense community effort to bring in crops before adverse weather could destroy them. Entire communities would mobilize for harvest activities, with everyone from small children to elderly adults participating in the race to gather the year's food supply. The quality and quantity of the grain harvest would determine not just immediate survival, but the family's prospects for the entire following year. Livestock management during autumn involved difficult decisions about which animals to keep through winter and which to slaughter. These decisions had to balance the immediate food value of slaughtered animals against their potential value for breeding, work, and ongoing production. Animals selected for slaughter had to be processed quickly and efficiently, with elaborate preservation techniques ensuring that nothing was wasted. The autumn preparation activities extended far beyond agriculture to include fuel gathering, clothing preparation, and home weatherization. Firewood had to be cut, split, and stored in quantities sufficient for the entire winter. Clothing needed repair and modification for cold weather protection. Homes required weatherproofing and insulation improvements to minimize heat loss during the coming months. Winter represented a dramatic shift in peasant life rhythms, when outdoor work became limited and activities concentrated around basic survival. The winter schedule was governed by conservation of resources, fuel, food, and energy, with activities carefully planned to minimize waste while maintaining essential functions. Indoor work during winter included textile production, tool maintenance, and various crafts that could be accomplished by firelight. These activities weren't busy work, but essential production that provided clothing, household goods, and items for trade or barter. The long winter nights were prime time for storytelling, skill teaching, and community bonding that strengthened the social networks essential for survival. The management of stored food resources required careful planning and strict discipline to ensure that supplies lasted through the entire winter period. Daily rations had to be calculated based on available supplies and estimated length of winter, with adjustments made based on changing conditions and resource availability. Winter health management required particular attention to nutrition, hygiene, and disease prevention during the months when fresh food was unavailable and living conditions were most challenging. The preparation of medicinal teas, the management of indoor air quality, and the maintenance of personal hygiene all required special techniques adapted to winter conditions. Chapter 12. Children in the Medieval World. The next generation of survivors' children. In medieval peasant families were not sheltered innocents protected from life's harsh realities, but essential contributors to family survival who began learning crucial skills from the moment they could walk. Understanding childhood in medieval times reveals both the remarkable resilience of young people and the sophisticated educational systems that prepared them for adult survival responsibilities. The medieval concept of childhood was fundamentally different from modern ideas about child development and protection. Children were viewed as small adults who needed to acquire adult skills as quickly as possible to contribute to family survival and ensure the continuation of essential knowledge. This wasn't neglect or cruelty. It was practical recognition that every family member, regardless of age, played crucial roles in the collective survival strategy. Child mortality rates in medieval times were staggeringly high, with estimates suggesting that 30 to 50% of children died before reaching adulthood. This harsh reality shaped family dynamics and parenting strategies in profound ways. Parents loved their children deeply, but they also understood that survival required practical approaches to child rearing that prepared survivors for adult responsibilities while not becoming emotionally overwhelming when children didn't survive. The education of medieval peasant children happened through direct participation in daily survival activities rather than formal schooling. Children learned by observing, imitating, and gradually taking on increasing responsibilities in household and agricultural work. This experiential education was remarkably effective at preparing young people for adult life, though it provided little in the way of literacy or abstract learning. Very young children, from about age 3 to 6, began their education by following adults around and helping with simple tasks appropriate to their size and abilities. They might collect eggs from chickens, help with simple food preparation, carry messages between adults, or assist with basic cleaning tasks. These activities weren't just keeping children busy, they were the beginning of systematic skill development. Children aged 6 to 10 took on more substantial responsibilities while continuing to develop essential skills. Boys might begin helping with animal care, learning to identify and treat common livestock problems, and assisting with basic agricultural tasks. Girls typically focused more on household skills, learning food preparation, textile production, and childcare techniques, though gender roles were often more flexible than historical stereotypes suggest. Adolescents aged 10 to 15 were expected to perform many adult tasks with minimal supervision. They had substantial responsibilities for animal care, agricultural work, household management, and childcare for younger siblings. During this period, young people often specialized in specific skills that matched their abilities and family needs, beginning to develop the expertise they would use throughout their adult lives. The apprenticeship system provided formal education for some children, though this was more common for urban craftsmen than rural peasants. However, rural communities had their own apprenticeship arrangements, where children might be sent to learn specialized skills from other families. A child might be sent to relatives or neighbors to learn blacksmithing, weaving, brewing, or other specialized skills that their own family didn't possess. Children's games and play activities weren't separate from education, but were integrated, learning experiences that developed skills essential for adult survival. Games often simulated adult activities, mock battles that developed physical coordination, building projects that taught construction techniques, or role-playing games that practiced social skills and community responsibilities. The seasonal rhythms of peasant life created different educational opportunities and responsibilities for children throughout the year. Spring brought lessons in planting, animal husbandry, and garden management. Summer intensive agricultural work taught endurance, teamwork, and agricultural techniques. Autumn harvest activities provided lessons in food processing, preservation, and resource management. Winter's indoor focus allowed for instruction in crafts, tool maintenance, and cultural knowledge transmission. Children's clothing and equipment were scaled-down versions of adult gear, designed to allow young people to participate effectively in adult activities. Children had their own work tools appropriate to their size and strength: small knives for food preparation, lightweight hoes for garden work, miniature spinning wheels for textile production. These tools weren't toys, but essential equipment that allowed children to make real contributions to family survival. The protection and care of children required community involvement rather than just parental responsibility. Extended family members, neighbors, and community elders all played roles in child supervision, education, and protection. This distributed child-rearing system ensured that essential knowledge was passed down even when parents died or were unavailable, and it provided multiple sources of guidance and support for developing young people. Discipline and behavioral management for children focused on developing self-control and responsibility rather than punishment for its own sake. Children who failed to meet their responsibilities faced natural consequences: cold, hunger, or discomfort that taught practical lessons about the importance of fulfilling obligations. Physical punishment was used, but it was typically reserved for behaviors that threatened family or community survival. The emotional and psychological development of medieval children occurred within the context of harsh realities and constant survival pressures. Children learned early that life was unpredictable and often dangerous, but they also developed remarkable resilience and adaptability. The strong community support systems provided emotional security, even when individual family situations were challenging. Religious and cultural education for children was woven into daily activities rather than separated into formal instruction periods. Children learned cultural values, moral principles, and spiritual beliefs through participation in community religious observances, listening to stories and songs, and observing adult behavior during both routine activities and crisis situations. The transition from childhood to adulthood was marked not by arbitrary age limits, but by demonstrated competence in essential survival skills. Young people were considered adults when they could perform adult work effectively, make sound decisions under pressure, and take responsibility for their own survival and the welfare of others. This competence-based approach to adulthood ensured that young people were truly prepared for adult responsibilities when they assumed them. Marriage and family formation often began in the mid-teens for young people who had demonstrated adult competence. These early marriages weren't about romantic love, as modern people understand it, but about creating new survival partnerships that combined complementary skills and resources. Young couples typically spent several years learning to work together effectively before taking on the additional responsibilities of raising children. Thatched control sonnet for